Hey everybody, it's Mr. Arvites back with another AP World History lesson. This is going to be about the Treaty of Versailles and the end of World War I. Really, it's going to be about why the Treaty of Versailles is one of the worst decisions ever made by any country involved. And so I guess we have to take ourselves to World War I, right? 9.1 million people died in World War I in combat. Now, we look at the death total of civilians and everything else due to starvation and revolts and all the other events that took place. That number jumps into the 20s. You also have flu epidemics, which kill large amounts of people. So Europe is decimated in 1919. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Now, the Treaty of Versailles is the peace treaty that sort of ends the entire thing. Now, before we start, we have to know that these countries all want different things. There's going to be 32 countries involved at the Treaty of Versailles. Now, when we say 32 countries, really, only about 10 of them are in a decision-making part of the Treaty of Versailles. But even less than that, it's only going to be 3 that are actually making decisions. And those 3 are going to be the United States, which we could argue doesn't really make many decisions in this treaty at all, under Woodrow Wilson. We'll have France under George Clemenceau. And then we'll have Great Britain under David Lloyd George. Okay? Now, all of these countries want different things. The United States, who did not participate in the war very much, really wanted to establish free trade. And Wilson wrote the 14 points. And part of the 14 points was that he thought that trade at sea needed to be non-restrictive. And we needed to do away with a lot of the borders that we had in terms of international trade. So he wanted a lot of free trade involved in this. He also wanted self-determination for colonies that Germany had. He also wanted self-determination for colonies that the Austrians and the Ottomans had. And so he wants for a lot of freedom for these different peoples. Now, this is all well and good, except there are 2 factors working against Woodrow Wilson in this, and one of them is that, quite frankly, the U.S. only fought in the war for a year, declaring war in 1917 and really only having active soldiers there for the last year or so, 10 months or so of fighting. And so, when you look at France, who loses over 1 million people, they look at the United States, and they're like, dude, you weren't involved in this. You don't need to make our decisions. Now, if we look at what France wants, France is on the extreme. They want revenge. Okay, they had a large amount of death. They had a large amount of economic turmoil. Remember, in northern France, it's completely destroyed because that's where this war is fought primarily, is in northern France, or at least on the western front. And so France wants a whole bunch of different things. And we'll talk about those a little bit more specifically, right? They want the demilitarized Rhineland. They want a return of the Alsace-Lorraine. They want economic compensation. They want Germany to admit the war is entirely their fault. They want to demilitarize Germany as well. They really want to punish the German people, and they want to make sure it never happens again. They're still a little salty from the Franco-Prussian War and World War I because of the amount of death, because of the tragedy that it was. They want to make sure that everything kind of goes on Germany's plate, and they want to prevent it. If they could, they would have broke the country up, but no one was really allowing that. Now, Great Britain is kind of in between the U.S. and France. Great Britain wants a return to economic normalcy. They want to be able to trade with everybody, so they want Germany to be punished, because keep in mind, if you're Britain and you're France, you're democratically elected leaders, your people do want punishments for Germany. Now, there are politicians on every side that speak in different directions on this. You have some American politicians who want to punish the Germans. You have some French politicians who don't want to punish the Germans, and same thing with the British. But it's a very much mixed bag. But the populace, the soldiers, tended to want some punishment to go on. And so Great Britain wants a little bit of punishment. They want Germany to have their navy reduced. Britain didn't care about the land army. They cared about the navy. And so they really want the navy to be reduced. They want all their colonies taken away. If Great Britain could, they would have taken all of them from them, though they'll have to split them up with the French. They also want some of the territory that Germany has in Europe to be released to create other countries, to create buffers. The other thing that Great Britain really wanted was some reparations payments. Not a lot, but some. They kind of tend to be in a little bit of the middle on this. Now, why does it all go south? Well, it goes south because largely Britain and France become increasingly more radicalized by this. Every other country involved is kind of ostracized by the process. And so why is this treaty horrible? Well, it does a couple of different things. And we can break up this treaty in a few categories, right? You could say financial compensation. We could say military reforms that are going to take place because of it, and then territorial exchanges. But I think the fourth you have to do is psychological. And let's start off with that one. One of the big things they put in the Versailles Treaty, which was signed on June 28th, 1919, was a war guilt clause where Germany had to admit that they caused the entire war. It was all their fault. They also had to admit that they were the first ones to use gas weaponry, and really it made it seem like they were the only ones who used it, which is completely fabricated and incorrect. And by the way, both sides claim that the other side was the first to use gas weaponry. So the Germans had to claim full responsibility for that. And by claiming full responsibility, they would then be responsible to pay back economically all of this. And for the German people, a very prideful people, this was to admit that they were wrong, they were the aggressors, they were the bad guys. This is psychologically horrible. The war guilt clause, while it doesn't affect anybody's necessarily like every day of life, it really made people mad about this event. And so in Germany, this creates a lot of unrest about the Versailles Treaty. It's kind of the icing on the cake at the end that really makes them unhappy. Now let's start off with some other things. Territorial. The Germans are going to lose a large amount of territory. One, they lose all of their colonial holdings. If they had stuff in China, which they did, it went to the Japanese, it went to the British. In Africa, they split their territories amongst the French and the British, respectively. The Austrians lose Central European or the Balkan territories. The Ottomans lose, obviously, the Middle East, which goes to Britain and France. So Britain and France get a lot of territory out of the Treaty of Versailles. The other thing they're going to lose is they're going to lose all of their Polish land. So Germany, if you recall, right, Poland was divided into three different areas, right? You had the southern part of Poland that the Austrian zone, you had the eastern part of Poland, the Russian zone, and then you had, of course, the western part of Poland, the German zone. The Germans are going to lose all of western Poland, and they had actually won eastern Poland against the Russians. They lose that too. And so they lose all of this farmland, and it was valuable farmland, the North European plain. This was big farmland for them. They lose it. And so that's some economic hardships that are going to take place because there's a lack of food. The country of Poland is going to be created as a result of this territorial exchange. We also look at the territory, the Sudetenland, as Hitler will call it in the 1930s. Czechoslovakia becomes a country. They take territory from Austria and Germany to create Czechoslovakia. Germany loses coal-producing and iron-producing territories in the present-day Czech Republic. The other parts they lose the Alsace-Lorraine, territory they took from France during the Franco-Prussian War in 1871. They also are going to lose a territory called the Saar. The Saar was a coal-producing territory right near the border of France and Germany, and they're going to lose that territory. France is going to be able to occupy that territory for 15 years and get the profits from the coal mining. And they'll be able to sell back that coal to Germany at a substantially upticked price with massive tariffs. So Germany loses its coal production, it loses large amounts of iron production, it loses large amounts of farming. And so we see this is actually really not shaping out to go very well for the German people. And then you factor in the colonial losses too, which are somewhat minor, but at the end of the day, they still are losses. Militarily speaking, let's look at those losses. The German army is going to be reduced to 100,000 soldiers. Now, that is interesting. There's also a financial cap as to how much money they can invest in that army, which Hitler breaks within 50 days of being chancellor, by the way. So that cap of soldiers, 100,000, some of you might say, oh, that seems like a lot of people. Remember, at the beginning of World War I, Germany had right around 2 million soldiers. So 100,000 is substantially less than 2 million. Okay, now think about all the jobs that just eliminated. And I'm not just talking about soldiers, because yes, okay, if they had 2.1 million soldiers, now they're down 2 million jobs, right? Effectively from their normal economic kind of output they had been having prior to the war. So you're down 2 million jobs there. But what about all the manufacturing jobs that go into the war? The weapon producers, the uniform producers, the equipment producers, all the military bases that are going to have to close down, the barracks and everything else, all the businesses surrounding those barracks that operate under the military's kind of financial wing, all taken away. Their military production is going to be reduced. They can't produce tanks. They can't produce machine guns. All these things get reduced in drastic numbers on how much they can produce. Now, the Air Force is also interesting. They say, hey, Germany, you can't have planes. You can't have warplanes. You can do other types of planes, travel, things of that nature, but no warplanes. Now, we do know Germany, by the way, breaks that almost immediately. They break a lot of the things almost immediately, but the Air Force one they're going to break very, very early on in this, building a couple of different new planes going forward, but they cannot have an Air Force. And as we know, in World War II, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, will be one of the most important factors in the German Blitz. The lastly is the Navy. Great Britain really was on this, and they said you cannot have a Navy, a substantial Navy. So they were reduced to 6 battleships and no submarines. And the total amount of ships is going to be reduced by 80%. And the amount of sailors is reduced by 80% as well. And so Germany loses its capacity to wage war at sea. Again, remember all of the things that this is going to affect. It's not just the soldiers being unemployed or the naval officers being unemployed. It's all of the manufacturing that goes with it. And so with all of these reforms come a massive loss of jobs. Okay, and by the way, all these soldiers returning home. Now we have a couple million, upwards of 5 to 6 million veterans. Those guys are not going to get jobs, okay? They're going to be unemployed in Germany, creating a very bitter mindset. Lastly, the financial compensations. This is where the Versailles Treaty really goes above all else on just being obnoxious. The financial compensations that are going to be pushed forward are going to add up to reparations payments that add up to right around 133 billion gold marks. Now, that may sound a little weird, but basically 132 billion gold marks had to be paid in finite resources and everything else. Now, Germany, again, can't produce coal, has a shortage of farmland, has a shortage of resources in general, and now you have to have them pay yearly reparations to Britain and France over this. The United States, by the way, does not sign the Treaty of Versailles, and in fact, we sign a separate treaty. Woodrow Wilson loses his negotiation process because he had a stroke in the middle of this process, and so he is not going to be involved at the very end of it. So, as it goes forward, as it moves on, this 132 billion gold marks is going to create what's called inflation, where Germany is going to produce more and more money for their population, and the money and the value of the currency is going to decrease. So in 1921, right, a couple years after, the German mark was worth about 32 to a dollar. A year later, it's 10,000 to a dollar. And we're going to get to a point where it's around 200,000 or so marks to a US dollar. Their currency becomes worthless. I'll put up some pictures of people like stacking up currency. You get old women carrying a wheelbarrow of currency to ride a bus, people burning it during the winter for warmth. Their currency becomes worthless. Their unemployment skyrockets to over 40%, and we have then hyperinflation where everything is just out of control. Now, Germany is going to go through a tailspin of that. That is the reason the Nazi Party gets kind of put into this, okay, is because of the desperate nature of what the Versailles Treaty put Germany into. Now, some of you might say, wait a second, Hitler doesn't take over until the 1930s. That's true, because the United States began to loan Germany large sums of money starting in 1924. And after that, American businesses really invested in Germany for about 5 years. But then they had this whole thing called the stock market crash of 1929. And we stopped investing, stopped loaning. And then Germany's economy crashed in 1930. And there's going to be 5 elections in that 2-year period that eventually lead to Hitler taking power. Now, you could go on a couple of other things on why the Versailles Treaty is absolute garbage. One, it completely ostracized Japan, making Japan kind of have this inferiority complex where they were just overly aggressive, and they're going to be like that going forward, and kind of creates their aggressive foreign policy of the 1930s. You could argue that Italy, Mussolini is going to criticize the Versailles Treaty heavily, just like Hitler did. Mussolini and Italy were on the right side of it, but they gained nothing, and so they're going to criticize this heavily and say Italy should have gotten a share of everything. This is the problem when you don't operate out of strength, and so the fascist party in Italy is going to explode off of that. You also have the creation of several countries that just really didn't work out very well, not very well protected. It also left Russia largely out of the thing too, because they had the communist revolt. The Versailles Treaty also created isolationist views in the United States. We basically said, you know what, next time let Europeans handle their own stuff, which is why the U.S. demilitarizes and kind of goes to more of a pacifist role in the 1920s and 30s until we're thrusted into the war in the early 40s. So the Versailles Treaty, absolute garbage, directly leads to World War II, because this is the reason why Germany is so desperate that they're going to lean on a dude like Adolf Hitler. So until next time, take it easy, guys.